Podcasting from a secret location deep inside the political colossus. This is Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance.
Part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Let me tell you, I'm a really smart guy.
What's your name again? John Miller. And you work with government? Yes, that's correct.
Oh my God, they've got a madman on their hands.
We will have no truce nor parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. If not us, who? And if not now, when?
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America, and this is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the walls.
This is Radio Free GOP with your host, Mike Murphy.
Hillary's health scare, new polling, is the race tightening, and an interview with GOP ad legend Larry McCarthy right here on Radio Free GOP.
He used to have a big career, but now he's had enough. Podcasting's like therapy, his shrink says it's great stuff. Radio Free GOP.
Hillary's health care, new polls, so much to talk about. But first, I want to quickly address something I brought up last week with my guest and friend Chris Mottola. We were reminiscing about media consulting stories and the like, and Chris mentioned that unfortunately, Ace Madison Avenue ad man Andy Berlin, who helped on the Dole campaign, had tragically passed away. Well, we remember Andy Berlin. He was a good friend, and we're very sad to hear of his passing. In particular, because he's not dead. He didn't die. He's fine. We were wrong. We had our facts scrambled on that one. So apologies to Andy, who is happy with his family living in semi-retirement in South Carolina, where, being a serial entrepreneur, he has started a magnificent new tequila brand, which we have now anointed the official, endorsed, special tequila of Radio Free GOP. It's called Tears of Llorona. It's magnificent stuff. The tequila press is in love with it. High quality stuff. Andy doesn't give this tequila away, but you can buy it like I did online or at your local fine spirits dealer. The website is tearsoflorona.mx. And Llorona is spelled with two L's. So Tears of LLORONA.mx. And you can learn all about one of the best tequilas you can buy. Thank you for providing it to a thirsty nation, Andy Berlin. And again, we're sorry we got that wrong. Your health is fine. Now, what about Hillary's health? We've all seen the big footage. Cable TV is a flutter of Hillary being helped by her aides kind of head first into her patented Scooby-Doo action van after leaving the 911 ceremony a bit early. The campaign says, and the doctor backs this up, that she has pneumonia. Fair enough. And she's doing better. Fair enough as well. The question is, why so long to release the info? They should have had the pneumonia diagnosis out seconds after the incident happened, so cable TV and the rest of the news media didn't have 24 hours to grind on why Hillary has this health problem. The speculation didn't help. The bigger problem, and this is endemic in Clinton world, it's part of the culture, it is a weakness, is their obsession with secrecy and not putting out information that would help them. So, what'll happen now? Regardless of the pneumonia story, larger questions about her health situation are now part of the race. It is an issue, and whether they like it or not, the Clinton apparatus has to deal with this. They could have done so much good by just getting the story out earlier and getting for once in front of it, but they just don't do that. They always reflexively dig in, be it the endless parsing and half-truths about emails or now what her health situation is. Now, Hillary partisans are probably yelling at their internet device saying, but wait, she's announced a lot more information than Trump has. True enough. We all got to look at Trump's doctor, Patch Adams, in the Hawaiian shirt with the bong, and his medical report was, as even the doctor now admits, completely laughable. The fact is, neither candidate has done anywhere near the disclosure that they ought to. Both are among the oldest people ever to run for president. If elected, Trump would be the oldest freshman president. So it's pretty obvious what both owe us. No more BS, no more parsing. true transparency. Now, I've been around politics long enough to learn that when you don't release everything in detail, it's for a very simple reason. You're hiding something. And so while Hillary's health may be fine, we need to know more details. The initial statement she put out was far more than Trump. She deserves some credit for that, but it wasn't enough. John McCain put out 1,200 pages of info. Both candidates should equally put out a much more comprehensive view, and they better do it soon. Trump, he gets away with a lot because people know he's crazy. Not an excuse, but a reality. Hillary, on the other hand, is being held to a higher standard because she's more likely to win. And the Clinton parsing has to end. They've got to be transparent about what the deal is. There was a very interesting piece in the Washington Post 2 days before the Scooby-Doo van bump incident where President Obama's doctor, no narrow partisan, remarked that he was curious about some of the medications she was on because they were really not the latest and greatest medications for blood thinning and other problems she had from her concussion and the issue she had with blood clots in her legs. The medicine she's on, Coumadin, is a pretty strong medicine with significant side effects. Now, I'm no doctor, but I know there are more modern treatments available. The fact is, for Hillary to make this issue go away, and better yet, to preempt the growing problem she has with people believing she is dishonest and not transparent, they've got to do the full disclosure. It is in their interest politically. Not to do it would be a big mistake. Now, let's talk about all these polls, because there's soy milk being spit out over oat bran breakfast all over Hollywood as Democrats get quite worried reading the news items about tightening polls in key states. We're going to go through all that, but first, we're going to do a little commerce, and then I'll be right back.
Mike Murphy, podcasting sanity, Radio Free GOP.
Rejoice, we have a new sponsor here at Radio Free GOP, and I love these guys. I know about this product. It's called the Great Courses Plus, and it's connected to the Great Courses thing that's been around for a long time, where you can get and watch wonderful, top-notch lectures by great university professors on almost any topic. We're all learners. There's no part of your life where you don't want to learn. I am a voracious reader. I wear through Kindles. I have too many books. And now I am hooked on these great courses at Great Courses Plus. Here is the improvement they've made that I think is terrific. It is now a streaming library. In other words, you sign up and you have total unlimited access to more than 600 different lectures, everything from food, the politics, cooking, physics, science, astronomy. It's all there. I've been particularly enjoying The Skeptic's Guide to American History, which is right up my alley. I'm also watching a great course on modern Chinese history. They're both terrific. They come in pieces too, so you can watch them at your own speed. And because it's digital streaming, you can watch them on your mobile device, you can watch them on your laptop. It is totally accessible and it is addictive. Now, we have a great offer for our Radio Free GOP listeners. You get the whole library, unlimited access for free for 1 month. That's right. You go in, one of our listeners, you come out Einstein, and it's free for a month to get into as many of these courses and lectures as you want. And then after that, there's a monthly fee. But a free month, unlimited access to the best college professors in America doing their best lectures, it's a no-brainer. I'm hooked on this, and I think you will be too if you try it. So how do you do all this? It's simple. You go on the web to start your free month. You go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/RFGs. That stands for, of course, Radio Free G from Radio Free GOP. That way we get a little credit, which would help us. Again, the website is thegreatcoursesplus.com/RFG. thegreatcoursesplus.com/RFG. Try it out. I think you'll like it. Now, we're also partially sponsored by my cheapskate pals at Ricochet.com. They are good guys, and they run the smartest and most civil center-right community on the web. No trolls, they guarantee it. Become a member, let your voice be heard, and listen to great podcasts like this one, all for just $5 a month. And Radio Free GOP listeners, you get the first month for free. All you got to do is go to Ricochet.com/join. That's Ricochet.com/join and sign up today. Now, let's talk about polling.
Here's some brand new polling, though it's too soon to know. Radio Free GOP, who gives a damn? It's all a scam.
part of the media business requires the people in that business to cover the campaign, no matter how small the daily whatever, as the Hindenburg crash. So a lot of sirens on set, a lot of excitement, and you can hear the panic growing in Democratic cities. We're broadcasting today from our secret underground location in the Los Angeles area, and I can't tell you how many Priuses I see weaving from lane to lane as people are listening to NPR and CNN and MSNBC, hearing reports about the races tightening, what's going on. Part of it is concern over that Hillary health issue we just talked about. I think when she gets that cleared up by being aggressively transparent, it'll get a little better. But the polling has tightened only a little bit, but that's enough to have started all this hysterical talk in the media. So I want to step back and encourage you, my loyal listeners, to look at the big picture, because that's always important in campaigns, not to get obsessed with the daily back and forth and to look at the big fundamental things. Now, here's what I'm going to do. This is going to be a little tricky. I'm going to try to do it without stumbling my way through. But I'm going to read you the Donald Trump number for the last 30 days, his ballot number, in the RealClearPolitics.com average of polls. Now, as you all know, RealClearPolitics.com does an average of all the public polling that's out there. Now, they throw some bad polls in with the good, but under the theory of large brute numbers, an average of all the polls is not a bad way to kind of look at the race rolling forward. So they publish this every day, and here is the Trump number for the last 30 days. 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 41, 42, 42, 42, 42, 42, 41, 42, 42, 42, 42, 42, 42, 42, 43, 43, 43, 43, 43, 43, 43. Not a lot of movement. He's inched up a little, but remember the margin of error in most of these polls is 4%. So more or less he's gone from 41 to 43 over the last 30 days. A slight tightening, but not huge. Now what about Hillary's number? It's been different. I'm not going to go through it all again. I've spent the gimmick, but basically Hillary's number ricochets back and forth between 48 and 46. Occasionally there was, I think, 145.5. So the real movement we're seeing in the race is less Trump and more Hillary. When she screws up, or she has press about one of her foibles, which there are many, or now probably in this health kerfuffle, her numbers drop a little bit. And then when the focus is on Trump, they go back up. She has been every day of the last 30 at either 48% or 46%, with I think one day where she wasn't. So the race is actually pretty stable. It is about a 4-point race. Now, there are always going to be state polls. Methodology differs. They're going to show some ebbs and flows. But unless Trump can carve his way out of the cul-de-sac, he's in a bad demography, not attracting the college-educated white women he really, really needs, let alone underperforming with college-educated white men, plus the fact that he's losing the minority vote by roughly infinity, he's going to be in a bit of a chokehold. The real fulcrum of this race, the real driver, is Hillary. Will she get her act together and get a 48 number, which kind of wants to happen, or will she keep bottoming out into the 46 area with Trump now at 43, a 3-point race, making things tight and kind of interesting? It's up to her. And the first step, as we said before, would be what she seems to be almost genetically predisposed not to do: show some transparency. I think part of it is the staff culture there. They got to get over it, because right now, despite all Trump's weaknesses, they're losing the race. Do I think Trump can win in the end? No. I think the demography is too hard and things will right size. But Hillary Clinton is not making it any easier for the voters to do what they're inclined to do, which is reject Donald Trump. It's a pretty sad lot across the board, because what all these low 40 polls say, be it 42 or 43 for Trump or 46 for Hillary, is the country's not crazy about either candidate. Now, some people might say, what about the libertarians? What about Jill Stein? Is she in jail, by the way? I've read some clip with Jill's got a little trouble with the law. The bigger factor will be the libertarian candidates, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. I don't believe we're going to know really what they can do until they crack through into the national news media more. Either get into a debate, which looks unlikely but not impossible, or some other moment that gets them a lot of press and attention so people can actually get an idea who they are to seriously consider a libertarian ballot choice. Now, the first big national news they got was bad. Somebody asked Gary Johnson on Morning Joe about Aleppo, and Johnson replied, Aleppo? I think he thought like Lepo, like it was some kind of three-legged parakeet or something. Not a particularly strong performance. His core constituency of free marijuana people were probably too hazed out to even notice it. But if he wants to grow beyond the small single-digit libertarian base, Gary Johnson's going to have to do a lot better than that. So right now, I'm still watching the two-way ballot. If the libertarians get on the radar screen in a good way, maybe they'll be worth including. But this is a 3 to 4 point race, and it's pretty much been so for a month. Okay, we're going to do a little more commerce, and then our interview with the one and only Larry McCarthy.
Fight for sanity. Sanity. In this crazy year. On Radio Free GOP.
Okay, time to do a little commerce. We still have some of our great Radio Free GOP t-shirts at our website, radiofreegop.com. Be the first in your neighborhood to wear one. Show you are part of the Republican resistance. These, unlike shoddy Trump goods, are made in America by American workers. They're high quality, excellent cotton. They're made by American Apparel, and they both, the navy blue and the white t-shirt, feature our logo, the Republican elephant upside down in distress. Make a statement. Have a great t-shirt, have a souvenir of this crazy, crazy election. And stay tuned. We have a crack artist working on a new t-shirt that I think is going to be the hit of the fashion world. I'll give you a hint. It's orange. Coming soon. Keep an eye out for that. And finally, you can always go to the website, radiofreegop.com, and click the Amazon button. That's part of a little caper we have going with Mr. Bezos. You buy stuff on Amazon after clicking that little Amazon button on our website, and a little bit of money falls off into our pocket. We get our beak wet as we sign politics. That will help defray the cost of bringing Radio Free GOP to you, and it'll get our sucker investor off the hook for some of the money that fool has sunk in. I'm very familiar with that because the sucker investor is me. Still, the ads are coming. I recently burned down my kitchen testing something that was a success. It was delicious. You're going to be hearing about that on the next podcast. And of course, we welcome the great courses. More than anything, we love our first sponsor, the great guys at the Private Equity Funcast. The Private Equity Funcast is a weekly podcast hosted by my pals Jim Milbury and Devin Matthews. They are partners in a Chicago-based private equity firm. Now, Devin and Jim have spent the better part of the last 15 years buying and managing mid-market technology companies. The Funcast draws from all their collective experiences to pull back the veil on private equity, much like we try to do here about politics on Radio Free GOP. Now, these guys talk about everything in that area, from the 7 deadly sins to private equity to the good, the bad, and the ugly of board meetings, which are a huge deal if you're in a private equity-backed company. So if you're the founder or owner of a business, if you work in management for a private equity-backed company, or perhaps you provide services to private companies as an investment banker, an accountant, or a lawyer, or like me, you just like to geek out on private equity. It's a huge part of the economy and you ought to learn about it. For any of those reasons, you should subscribe to the Private Equity Funcast on iTunes or Google Play. One more time, the Private Equity Funcast on iTunes or Google Play. They're funny too. You'll enjoy the podcast. I know I do. Okay, let's get back to work.
Radio Free GOP.
Okay, our interview today is with an old friend of mine and a true old pro, a seasoned veteran of the Republican media consulting wars. He started out in the 70s. He makes me look like a spring chicken, which is pretty hard to do. I started in the early 80s. He came out of the world of New York Republican politics, and he'll talk about that, how the Northeast has changed, and how he met a TV producer quite famous who changed his life. Later, he would become famous for producing the Willie Horton commercial. We're going to hear it all from Republican veteran strategist Larry McCarthy.
It's time to ask some questions and go behind the scenes. Here's our latest interview. We'll try to keep it clean. Radio Free GOP.
We're here with my old friend, legendary Republican media maven, Mr. Larry McCarthy. Thank you for doing the Radio Free GOP podcast.
Mike, it's great to be on with you.
Now, you've been in this racket like me for a long time, but I'm going to start with the question we always ask everybody. How did you get into this?
Well, I like to think that I've never actually made a career decision, that I just sort of flow from one thing to the next. I was starting Georgetown University.
Oh, Hoya Saxa.
Hoy so what rocks? And I was offered a 2-month part-time job for then Senator New York Jacob Javits of New York. And the task was to clean up his mailing list, which hadn't been updated in 20 years. But in those days, all the addresses were on these little metal addressograph plates, organized by address. So I had to alphabetize 2 million little pieces of metal. And it didn't take me 2 months part-time. It took me 2 years part-time. And when I finished, they said, you really know your alphabet. But you see that funny machine over there? That's called a computer. And we're going to keep all the addresses on that. So they threw out 2 years of my work, but they kept me on to do filing and driving Javits around. It was a great, great part-time job. I learned far more with Javits part-time than I learned all 4 years at Georgetown.
So I have to ask you a question. 2 million pieces of metal from a datagraph machine being hand alphabetized. Were there days where you started to think about becoming, the next Unabomber or then the first Unabomber? I mean, that must have been the most tedious damn thing in the world. Or did you find like a puzzle like Zen in doing it?
I kind of got into Zen because it paid me the then lordly sum of $2.07 an hour, which was far more than I was making that summer working at Zayre, which was sort of the low-rent department store of the era. So I was a happy camper at 207, and they paid you in cash. Every 2 weeks, they'd give you this U.S. Senate envelope, and it would have $40 and 2 20s and a single and a few pennies. It was great.
Oh, my God. So then you became the body man, which all of us in this racket know is the great job starting out because you're kind of the glue on the candidate or the senator. You're around. You learn to be sharp and always listening, but you see a lot.
You do see a lot. Javits was a world traveler. He always seemed to me like he was bringing peace to the Middle East. So, one day they said Javits lands at Dulles at 12:30, which in those days was like in a different time zone. So pick him up at 12:05, and it's got a 12:30 vote on the floor. So you got to really floor it. So Javits was a speed demon with a big, big car, Mustang with a huge engine. So we were just flying down the Dulles toll road at 90 miles an hour, which he said, go faster. And we made it to the vote with 1 minute to spare. And meanwhile, I learned all about gold in my ear and bringing peace to the Middle East.
What was his personality like? And I should explain that Jacob Javits was kind of a legend in New York politics. He was one of these larger-than-life senators. He was one of the old-school Northeastern liberal Republicans. And, was also quite a feisty personality, I've often been told. Because that's a breed of politician we don't see anymore, the Javits, the Lowell Weikers, those guys from the Northeast.
He was not terribly personable with staff. He was all business. He worked his brains out. He did play tennis like 3 or 4 times a week, well into his 70s, before he got sick there at the end. He was a very good tennis player. He would go off into the night with, thousands of file folders, which would come back the next morning all written up with his notes and what he wanted to do. He was a very dedicated guy, and he really worked hard at it. And, of course, that breed no longer exists. You can say that Susan Collins and Mark Kirk are liberals today, but not really. They're not nowhere near where Javits and Weicker and Chuck Percy were in their era.
Yeah, there used to be a much wider spectrum in both parties. You would have plenty of Southern Democratic senators who were more conservative than, Northeastern liberal Republican senators, the Ed Brooks or the guys you mentioned. It's kind of interesting how the spectrum has narrowed so much on each side, kind of the rise of the primary interest groups, I think.
Right.
So there you are. You're doing 90 miles an hour with the spluttering senator. And what happened next to you? And you should probably explain how things wound up for Jacob Javits, because that's kind of a pivotal race in the history of the Republican Party and many would say the conservative movement.
Well, I actually got hired onto the campaign when I graduated, the 1974 campaign. So I was arbitrarily assigned to the press office, and one of my tasks every day, twice a day, was to take the press releases and the media advisories. And in those days, in New York, at least New York City, I would walk from AP to UPI to the New York Daily News, the New York Times, twice a day, hand delivering press releases, because faxes were very exotic technology then and not very reliable. So I simply hand delivered twice a day. And it was a wonderful way to see New York, and it was a perfect time of the year. So Javits won that race against, as we called him then, Red Ramsey Clark. the former Attorney General. And then I got hired back onto Javits' Senate staff as a press aide, and I did that well enough to then go on to work for first Congressman John Hines from Pennsylvania, then the Hines Senate campaign. And then when Hines won, I was a 23-year-old Senate press secretary. And then, 2 years after that, Hines won the senatorial committee chairmanship, so I moved over there and did a couple of years the Senate campaign committee, and then got hired by Roger Ailes.
It's funny. You did the full tour. They used to have a cruel and quite unfair but rather funny nickname for John Hines because he was also a liberal Republican from Pennsylvania. They used to say he was like the family's ketchup, thick, rich, and red. Cruel, but so you came out of kind of that northeastern, more liberal wing of the party, but also a wing of the party that would attract voters that we don't see. They would have a respectable number of African Americans. It was a different electoral coalition too.
Yeah, and people forget, but in 1960, Jackie Robinson campaigned for Richard Nixon.
Right.
There was a time when Republicans in the Northeast, especially, would get 20, 30% of the African American vote. And sadly, those days are much harder to find because that breed of Republican in those states doesn't really exist anymore. But we had a much different Republican Party then. We had Republicans who could routinely win election after election in big northeastern states.
And so Javits wound up later in the fight of his life against a Long Island politician, which there was always a rumor that they wanted to get him out of the machine politics because he was a tough guy to deal with, though I've always found him kind of charming, named Al D'Amato. And that was one of the great epic old center Northeastern Republican versus the new conservative coalition battles in the lore of Republican statewide primaries. And Al D'Amato eventually became the senator.
Al D'Amato, I think, was widely underestimated by everybody, including the Javits campaign of 1980. Al D'Amato, for those of us who know him and love him, was a street-smart, pretty profane Republican who was very proud of being lower middle class, if you can use that term. He was later called, Senator Pothole because he paid so much attention to local and hyper-local issues. But D'Amato, in the 1980 race in the primary, campaigned very, very hard against Javits and openly had commercials saying essentially Javits was old and sick and going to die, and why would you vote for him?
Yeah.
It was a very rough campaign. Arthur Finkelstein was the master of that campaign, and it was not very popular, but D'Amato beat Javits in the primary, and that was really one of the first signs that Northeastern Republicans were starting to fade away.
Yeah, that was one of the really pivotal races in the emergence of the so-called New Right, and it's where Finkelstein really made his bones. I've always been kind of fond of D'Amato. I remember later, a couple of terms into his Senate career, I was on a flight out of New Orleans. I can't remember where we were going. It was like a hub and spoke thing, and I both had to change planes, but I wound up sitting next to Al D'Amato, who was very funny, and we had a great conversation, and it was the afternoon. We each had a drink or two, and I remember we were getting off the plane, and all I had was a little briefcase overnight, like mini suitcase thing. And Al had like a big briefcase, and he had this enormous suit bag, which it couldn't even fold. It was so stuffed. It was like a big sausage. And he looked at me and he goes, "Kid, help me with that." So I'm dragging this thing out, this like duffel bag looking suit bag, and I kind of catch it in my arms, and I'd had a drink or two, so we'd become like best of buddies. So I very rarely for me drop the staff thing of calling him senator and say, "What the hell, Al, do you have a body in here?" And D'Amato didn't lose a beat. He looked at me and goes, "Shh, quiet, kid, or I'm not going to bring in any more jobs."
D'Amato was a very colorful guy. He openly did mafia jokes. He would engage in literal screaming contests with female staff members with lots of epithets flying back and forth both ways. But they all loved him.
Yeah, he was a character, and he's still around New York. He's a big power broker up there.
Yeah, he is.
You said the magic words a little while ago as we're working through your career history. You leave the Senate committee after your Hines days, and you show up and you wind up working for the one and only Roger Ailes. You've got to tell me what that interview for that job was like and what it was like to meet him for the first time. Kind of set that scene for us.
A little-known historical fact, Roger Ailes actually worked for me. At the Senate committee as the communications director, Roger Ailes was the speech consultant to the NRSC, which meant that we would, any Republican senator that wanted to work with Roger on improving their speaking style, Roger was available. And he was just fabulous at it. He was a great coach. All the senators who worked with him loved him. So Roger worked for me. And later, when I left the committee in 81, Roger said, how'd you like to move to New York and work for me? I said, I'd love to. So I spent 6 happy years working for Roger, who is, all current troubles aside, is a genius at many fields. People think of him just as either Fox News or as a GOP media guy. But when I was there and knew him, he was also had produced a play on Broadway, a big hit, The Hot L Baltimore. He managed singers. He had a booking agent who worked for him to book bands and magicians and everybody else. He had, I think, one of the most successful businesses. Just him and John Kraushaar coaching media executives, and he was a great talent at that. And in the off year at ALS, the non-political years, we would produce, multiple TV shows, specials and documentaries and things like that. So I really learned the television side as well as the political side from Roger.
Yeah, he was an old school showbiz guy. Started out, of course, on the Mike Douglas show as the Wonder Kid producer. And he was one of these guys who would look at a minute of a TV show or a beat of a play or a magician's act and instantly have 3 notes. And, he just had that. I remember the first time I really met Roger was on the 88 Bush campaign. George Herbert Walker Bush ran for president, and I'd worked for Bob Dole in the primary. But Alex Castellanos, my partner at the time, and I had an interview, and I went in to see Ailes, and I was a bit intimidated because this was the famous Roger Ailes. So I got a hold of his book that was part of his big media coaching business, You Are the Message, that he did with John Kraushaar. And so I read the book, and the book had a big thing about eye contact. Always keep eye contact in a meeting, And it was one of these 11 tips. You could tell it was kind of the course turned into a book that they'd put people through. So I walk in there and I lock this mackerel stare at him, like a serial killer. And I'm trying to do the book. And he's halfway through his rant and he goes, "What the hell are you staring at?" I said, "It's in your book." And he laughed, and we became pals at that point. And he graciously gave us, Alex and I, a role on the 88 Bush campaign, and I learned a lot from him. But you really worked for him. You were there. So what do people not know about Roger Ailes other than his biography? Because he has kind of this image, and now, it's tragic to see the trouble he's in. But, maybe well-earned. I never got that vibe when I was around him. It was never like bring in the showgirls. But, current troubles aside, give us a little bit of a three-dimensional portrait of somebody you worked closely with for years.
I was there for 6 years, and in some respects, they're the best 6 years of my life in terms of just learning new things and seeing what I consider one of the great geniuses of our lifetime working across multiple fields. Like you, I never ever saw any kind of vibration like like the legal issues he's had lately at Fox News. But he is, without a doubt, the person I learned the most from in terms of making TV commercials. But he also had the knack to make virtually instantaneous or snap judgments that were just dead on. And the numbers didn't really show it precisely like that, but he could take a number and make it into a concept that would work almost immediately. I can remember in the 84 McConnell campaign, McConnell was then the Louisville County Judge Executive, much like he is today, hard-charging, very focused, excellent fundraiser. But after a couple of flights of media, Lance Tarrant and Jan van Lohuizen walked into a meeting. This is back in the days you actually had meetings, and said, well, the latest data has us 44 points down to D. Huddleston. And there was a quiet moment around the room. Because we didn't know what to do when you're 44 points down in early August. So, Roger, we flew home to New York, and Roger came in the next day and he said, I had the Lance Tarrant summary on as I was watching TV, and a dog food commercial came on. And I thought, what about chasing Huddleston? He missed all these speeches and have dogs chase him. So that was the origin of the famous Bloodhounds commercial and the sequel Bloodhounds commercial. And in those days, you wrote scripts on a typewriter, and then every time you made a change, you had to retype the whole thing. So, I'm sure I retyped those scripts, dozens of times, and it was a pretty hard sell to McConnell because he didn't quite understand all the imagery and the humor. But he said, I'm 44 points down. Why not? So the now famous Bloodhounds commercial became sort of the icon of the campaign, and we closed that and a graphic spot that set up the fact that Huddleston was missing votes to make speeches for money. We set up a graphic spot and then did Bloodhounds for a week, and we closed 17 points in 10 days. And we just kept inching away, and we stalled about 5 points down in late October. So we did Bloodhounds 2, with the Bloodhounds actually chasing an actor, a Broadway actor who was out of work, who was dressed as Huddleston, and we had him chased all through the fields of New Jersey. And that, coupled with McConnell relentless fundraising and focus, and most importantly, Ronald Reagan with a big push at the end, got Mitch McConnell elected to the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, that's one of those spots, and they don't come around often, where it really clicks and becomes kind of a thing. And so people talk about it, it's sticky, and you look in the polling, you've got rocket fuel. And the other guys don't know what to do because they can't put that toothpaste back in the can. It's a Frisbee craze or whatever, the spot. And so they just have to take the hammering, and next thing you know, they're in a, neck and neck race. Now, there's one bit of trivia about the famous Bloodhound spot, and we will put those up on our website so people can see them. But there's some guy, some probably New York actor in a Hawaiian shirt sitting there reading the paper by the pool. Did we ever find the identity of that secret player?
Years later, his identity was revealed. I'm not sure if it was the National Enquirer or the Star or whichever revealed it, but it was actually me. I played I think my character description was California drug dealer sitting by pool. So I had a Hawaiian shirt on. I had for my only time in my life, my shirt open to the navel. I had a lovely gold chain, which I think I got off the set from Rocky, and I was reading Variety. So I was in that one. It's also in Bloodhounds 2. Sitting as an innocent bystander in the cafe where the dogs and Huddleston run through.
So you're the Hitchcock of the Huddleston campaign. You worked yourself in.
Those were my two greatest Hitchcock appearances.
Were Mitch and Ailes too cheap to get you into SAG now that you're a working actor? You just you were background. You got lunch.
I could never get another role. I was in a crowd scene for Dan Quayle and a couple others, but I never worked regularly enough. The hardest part of the Bloodhound shoot was actually the Bloodhounds, who I'm not sure if you've ever tried to work with Bloodhounds, but they are enormously strong, they are enormously stupid, and they are enormously horny. So that shoot took about 18 hours, and half of that was trying to keep the Bloodhounds off each other because they were just at each other all the time. So for our second shoot, when we did Bloodhounds 2, we did it in a different location. The first one was in and around D.C. The second one was we went out on a weekend and we scouted a quiet little town in New Jersey and looked really quiet because we had a couple little urban scenes there. And we thought, well, we're going to order all same-sex bloodhounds this time, and we thought we were really smart and ahead of the game. So we had scouted over the weekend. We pulled up into Morristown, New Jersey, 9 a.m. Monday morning, and we didn't realize what Morristown, New Jersey is famous for. And for those few people who realize it, Morristown, New Jersey is the site of the National Seeing Eye Dog Training Center. So we pour out of the van with 4 crazed bloodhounds, and all around every street has multiple German shepherds and golden retrievers with their trainers and sunglasses walking around, and all of a sudden they see crazed bloodhound trying to hump them.
Oh boy, they must have hated you guys.
Yes, they did.
My dad has a black lab that is a former seeing eye dog that failed the final graduation test, and we're all afraid to ask, and they won't really tell us what went wrong. Stepped out into traffic, saw something that looked tasty, so we're not quite sure, but Fiona's a very sweet dog. But that training is very rigorous, so that must have been just a complete Keystone Cop deal. Were they the same bloodhounds from spot 1 and 2, or was there a switcheroo involved?
They were different bloodhounds. The first set of bloodhounds were from some trainer in D.C., second time from New York. But the second time, they were all the same sex. I think they're all boys at this time. But they were armed and ready to go.
I did a dog spot for Romney when we did the race for governor. And it was the old sleeping at the Treasury, or running against state treasurer. And we brought in a stunt pair of Basset hounds. And the dog gag was the dog had to like sleep while the actors were doing a lot of action behind. So we found the two most lackadaisical Basset hounds in the history of show business, who of course had to come up. It was either Atlanta or Virginia. So it was a big like, oh, we can't let them know. And one would work for a while and then get bored with being lackadaisical, and you'd switch to the other one. It was like twins, with kids on television. So it worked pretty well, but like it was another spot. It caught on, and now the dog's Duncan the Basset Hound becomes a celebrity, has to make personal appearances. So of course the dog agent's holding us up for money, and I want to switch out for a locally grown Basset Hound, but this dog had a very distinctive face, so we had to cut it. Romney, of course, a fiscal conservative, did not like the idea of cash money being paid to a dog actor. But anyway, the Duncan became quite a star up there. When a interesting spot like that works, man, it really works.
Yep.
So a question about Mitch. You're doing these crazy bloodhound spots. The polling's on fire. All of us who know Mitch McConnell know that he could be a political consultant if he wanted to be. He's very interested in the nuts and bolts of politics. He's a very sharp guy. What was he like to work with? What's the dimension of Mitch McConnell people don't know? Because, his public image is this kind of hatchet man of the Senate, tough guy, which is true, but he's more complicated than that. I've spent enough time around him to know that, but you really have.
Yeah, I worked on the 84 race working for Roger, and then came back on my own to do the 2008 and 2014 races. And what would shock most people is that Mitch McConnell is a very funny guy. Very dry, very funny, very, very easy to work with. He trusts his team enough to know that I may not get this exactly what they're trying to do, but I'm going to go with the flow because I trust them. In 2014, we had an idea for a comedy spot because the Democrats are always in the close trying to do a reverse bloodhound spot on McConnell. So in 2008 and 2014, we had to have our version of bloodhounds to refute them, sort of better and funnier than theirs. So in 2014, we did a comedy spot where Mitch is reviewing possible commercials. And one of them is a commercial which the director, who was me, was saying would involve bloodhounds. And he never quite understood how all these pieces were going to fit together as we were rubbing liverwurst all over his fingers to have the bloodhounds lick his hands in that key shot. But he trusted his team, and he always has the best team, regardless of which cycle and which consulting team he had. It is always almost a flawless campaign in McConnell's re-election efforts.
Yeah, the last re-elect I thought was the flawless campaign of that cycle. And I thought it was always very smart that humorous ads with a lighter touch were a good vessel to carry McConnell with, because he has that deep voice and that serious demeanor, that public persona, and so you had kind of the right yin and yang there to have a lighter ad cover him. I remember, you ever see the Bobby Goodman ad for him before Ailes came on?
Oh, the horseshit ad. Famous.
Well, there's the famous horseshit ad, which is pretty funny, but there's the speedboat ad where he's like crossing the lake, like George Washington on a speedboat. And it's very Goodman. It's big production spot, and it's very large. But it was like, in my view anyway, a click too far for Mitch. While the lighter stuff, which I think they tried to get to with the shoveling ad when he was a county judge there, worked pretty well. It's interesting sometimes how the tone of the ad has to work in the context of the personality of the candidate, and sometimes things that are different rather than the same actually add up to more. So in your years with Roger Ailes, what was the most useful thing you learned from working for Roger Ailes?
The most useful thing I learned working for Roger was something that he was fond of saying, that it's all the same box that it comes out of: entertainment, political commercials, news. And by the box, of course, was a television. And he always placed a great deal of stress on, we have to make the commercials as engaging or as entertaining, if that was ever possible, as possible, because people see that same box for entertainment, for news, for political, and if you can put a little dose of entertainment in, it makes it a far more effective commercial. I know Roger has always told the story of when he had Richard Nixon and did he have a belly dancer like Little Egypt in the same green room? And he tried to give Nixon a short course in the importance of TV and don't underestimate it. And that's how he ultimately got hired for the 68 Nixon campaign. It's the same box. And to the extent that you can try to make your spots entertaining and engaging and watchable, it's all for the better.
I'm glad he didn't try to give Nixon a course in belly dancers, too, now that we've learned a little more.
Yes, we would want to go back in that reverse history. We have a spot up now in New Hampshire for Senator Kelly Ayotte in which she is batting. The spot is all the attacks from outside groups, which are all false, of course, which are coming at her. And so we shot her on a softball diamond, basically just hitting pitches out of the park from evil-looking pitchers who had lies and false attacks on their helmets, and it's a metaphor spot, but it's entertaining. And people have been walking up to Kelly and say, "Did you really hit all those softballs?" And Kelly's a very good athlete and really has very good eye-hand coordination. And she said, "Yes, they couldn't fake that." So we shot for an hour and a half and we got a very memorable commercial, which is apparently doing quite well for us.
What was her batting average, pitches versus hits?
It was very high. We wouldn't try this with a candidate who was less coordinated because it's hard to do in a short amount of time. But she really did well.
Late in the Strom Thurmond years, Alex and I got hired to make a 30-minute documentary about him, which was, he had no real opponent, but he was up there in age. So the idea was to do like a half-an-hour show, The Great Man of South Carolina, and waltz to re-election. So we followed him around, and Alex shot him one day, and Thurmond had this reputation of being the big athlete and the very virile, tough guy. All the jokes about having kids when he was, so old. So they put him in the great kind of Jack LaLanne outfit and sent him down to the Senate gym, and he's on the sectorized bench press machine, and Alex couldn't resist a cutaway of this enormous weight stack going up and down. He had like 3 guys on the pulley, like it was the Incredible Hulk, and it was just subtly edited in there as kind of an inside joke, and of course it worked just fine.
This is a little bit out of the time sequence, but Strom Thurmond is one of the most vivid figures for me in one particular episode. So back in the days that I was at the Senate Committee, which is the 80 cycle, we would do all the high-dollar fundraising dinners at Heinz's house, which was quite large, a former Russian embassy in the 1800s, and all the senators would come and donors. And Strom Thurmond did something I've never seen anybody else do in my life. He would go up and down the food lines, and he would pick out all the really good, tasty-looking hot hors d'oeuvres, messy hors d'oeuvres too, and he would put them in a napkin, and he'd put them in his pocket for later. So Thurmond would leave these receptions with overflowing pockets, and you wouldn't want to know what was in there by then. And he would always, as he's leaving, try to express his warmest appreciation to all the very attractive young female finance staffers. And it was sometimes affection that was not returned and was quite shocking, shall we say.
Oh, yeah. No, one of the rules of the Senate for young staffers was don't get into an elevator with the senior senator from South Carolina. I should get an old Thurmond staffer, though, to get on here, and we're just doing an interview of Thurmond stories. My favorite one was allegedly he loved to look at the FEC report that would show the donors of everybody who gave money to his opponent, whatever year it was, and he'd see the South Carolinians on the list, and he'd call them up. "There's Senator Thurmond. What'd I ever do to you?" Just the old days of eccentrics rather than TV weathermen in the Senate. So there you are. You're working for Roger. 6 years are up, and you decide to move on your own, or what happened? What was the catalyst to take the next step?
So I got one of the great teaching scams, which I think you've actually done as well, which is the fellowship at Harvard's Institute of Politics.
Sure.
Which is just a great place to hang out for 5 and 6 months and impress these young students with your worldly knowledge and your politics. And of course, what you figured out pretty quickly is it's just basically a way for Harvard students to get their resume out to a broader part of the world. But it was a great time. And then I went off and hung my own shingle. And
what year? What year was this?
This was fall '87.
Right, and you had a couple of nice wins in the Yale days, of course, that McConnell race. So you were hot in your career, and it was time to kind of make the jump. How'd Roger take that? Because he's such a loyalty freak.
Roger didn't take it well. We didn't part on the best of terms, but we repaired it. I knew he's going to be doing Bush 41 in '88, and I'd actually shot for Bush 41 for the PAC in '86, but I didn't really want to work in that campaign. Then our paths crossed in Dole '88, and I think you and Alex, I think, were the first media consultants, and I was the fourth.
I was, I think, the first and third Dole media consultant.
So I was doing the 6 weeks Rumsfeld for president, which didn't end well, but much of the Rumsfeld senior team then went to Dole because Dole kept firing his team. So Bill Brock asked me, would I come in to Dole? And I said, I've seen the video that Mike and Alex did, and it's great. Why would you get rid of them? He said, oh, they're already gone. We burned through Smith and Haroff and then Don Ring, and we're not happy with anybody. Can you come in? So I came in. I'm not sure which number I was and whether it was Roman numerals or whatever it was. And later on, I was kind of a one-man band for that because I wasn't really anticipating on doing that. So I brought you and Alex back, and we had the problems in Galesburg and the unfortunate ending to the Dole campaign. But Dole would have been a great president. He was not a great candidate, but he would have been a great president, much like Jeb. Dole knew what needed to be done, had the guts to do it. God didn't give him huge gifts as a performer or as an entertainer.
Yeah, it was another year where it was the substance that the voters didn't want. I was hired originally, I think Don Ring was doing it, and I was young then. In '87, I was in my mid-20s, but, Alex and I had a couple of kind of good, we were just coming up. I'd had some good races with him. And so I was hired to, basically the first meeting was like, hey, how'd you like to do the radio? And luckily that didn't happen. I wound up in charge of making a movie about Bob Dole. So I went out to Iowa and followed him around the caucus. I went to Russell, Kansas, and I rapidly figured out that the Dole High Command had, about 20 people with nobody really in charge. And if I listened to them, it was going to be the worst film in the world because that wasn't really their competence level. So I thought, I'll just go rogue. So I became the missing guy, just left with some money and went out and made the damn film I wanted to make. And it came back and everybody loved it. It was Dole's favorite thing in the campaign, and they promptly fired me because I was unreliable. But I knew better to be fired over the right thing than not over the wrong. Then Dole loses New Hampshire, and I get pulled back in, and I had the dark comic opera experience of riding the slide to doom, and I think you were around for that too.
Yes, I was.
Okay, yeah, it's a murky memory. Other than I remember loving Bob Dole.
I love Bob Dole, and the Dole Consultant Alumni Group is a very large group.
It is. Many people got to. And then, in '96 when he ran again, I didn't work for him that cycle. I worked for Lamar Alexander because of my love of long shot guys I think who ought to be president. Though I never criticized Dole, and he'd always pull me aside at like debate green rooms, and we'd have a nice word or two. He did one of the nicest things ever. This is a long story, so I'll try and make it very quick. But you might have been there. I'm old. I don't always remember all the details. But remember the Galesburg show, the live extravaganza?
Oh, I was there. You were there. Mike Pence was there. Alex, I think, was there.
Right. Alex was there. I remember the Schaumburg Hyatt. That was like the headquarters of the fall of the Roman Empire. And the campaign's running out of money, and we're in the Illinois primary, and Dole wants to make a last stand. And the phone rings, and I remember they called me up to the suite. There was this melting ice sculpture there, And, what was that Brock guy? It was the manager, Bernie somebody.
Oh, Bernie Winden.
Bernie Winden. He hands me the phone. Senator Dole, for you can tell him it can't be done. And it's Dole out in the road somewhere. He just fired a bunch of people, running a campaign, not a jobs program. It was not good. And he said that he wanted to do a live TV show in 2 nights. Yeah, you were right there. I remember it all now. And he thought the live broadcast would be the big turnaround. And somehow I had been the guy that caught the phone call to say, Senator, putting a live TV show together with limited resources in 48 hours, it's going to be very, very hard
on the road. It was in Galesburg. It wasn't even in a studio.
Right, exactly. We'd have to build it. And I'll never forget Dole. I had such admiration for, he kind of took a long pause and he says, I know I'm going to lose, but I want to go out doing something. And it just moved me so much. So, of course, Senator, we will do it. And then we all sprang into action. I remember we basically stole the grip and light department of the Michael Mann show that was shooting in Chicago, Crime Story, the Dennis Farina thing. And, we're bore everybody to death, but it was a long, complicated thing. We built it. We got a satellite truck by hook or by crook, and we did a live town hall, and then we had a massive power failure. After we burned the lights in for 2 hours, we had the mysterious power failure halfway through. And so after this thing, we had a tape back at WGN Chicago, covered it, that we would go to, so it wasn't like we went dead for half an hour, but it was not optimal at all. We are on the plane, the 737, the Sky Pig or whatever it was called, flying back in the middle of the night, and Alex and I and Mike Pangaro were all in the back. You were just incredibly depressed. And Dole came and sat with us, because you could hear the catcalls of the media. Senator, are you going to throw those guys out at 20,000 feet? And Dole just sat down and thanked us all for giving it a try. And I'll never forget that. He was just the class act of class acts.
He was. And is.
Exactly. And tough as nails. Painkillers, don't need them. After the Dole campaign, you go off and you start doing statewides like crazy. How would you say the media consulting role in the average statewide has changed from when we came up in the mid-'80s through the 90s to today?
It's like comparing Renaissance media to, 600 years later. It seems like that.
Yeah, it does.
In the 80s, a fax was high technology. All the spots got to stations via FedEx. We would, every night in New York, there were probably 10 of us at Ailes, and we would all gather at 9 o'clock in the bullpen, just having made the dubs at National Video across the street, and we would have to figure out getting 200 different FedExes that night to the various stations they're going to. So many of us would run to FedEx at 9:26, and sometimes we would make it, and sometimes we wouldn't. And when we were at 9:35, a lovely female production manager named Felicia Sugarman would go around to the back door and try to sweet talk her way in to drop off the last 20 FedEx stubs. And today, of course, they go as a giant email. And campaigns were much slower then because you didn't know what spots were running for your opponent. We had real meetings then, not conference calls. We had conference calls too, but we had 2-day meetings to decide things. It was a much slower environment. And today, campaigns almost literally are 24/7, and email never stops, and you keep getting intelligence from myriad electronic digital sources that capture your opponent's media and can tell you down to the second that it ran in Manchester, New Hampshire, or Burlington, Vermont, or Portland, Maine. So you are literally on call virtually nonstop. And campaigns then were, maybe 10 months, and now they're basically 22 months. So that they're far more physically draining than they used to be, and far more immersive.
Yeah, I remember really getting excited about the new digital speed and loving that. But now that I've lived in both worlds, back in the day, like you were saying, when the FedExing of the dubs was the big thing, I remember driving like a maniac to Dulles, to the last FedEx place that was open, the very latest, right before they'd load the plane, and trying to sweet talk the stuff on. Occasionally the all-night drive by the intern to a media market, driving station to station to hand-deliver dubs, at least on the East Coast. I mean, all that drama. It meant the trafficking of the spot was a big deal, which also meant the thinking of what the spot would be was a big deal. You would have the day or two meetings. You frankly had more time to think. And I'm not sure that now, when there's a lot of ability to panic and jump around and do new stuff in 14 minutes, there's not as much time to think, so I'm not sure the thinking is that well done. I mean, what's your take strategically? Have we lost something with this huge toolbox that allows instantaneous tactics to spring up every hour?
We have. It's inevitable, and it'll only keep getting faster and faster as we get older and older and less able to cope with it. You know, in the 80s and even in some into the 90s, you would plan campaigns like they did the Normandy invasion. Plan months ahead. You would know what spot you're probably going to run in the third week of September, because you'd probably shoot it in July, and you'd planned for it a couple months before that. So you had a good roadmap before anything ever happened of how your campaign would lay out. And now you don't really know for sure, because in the old days, it was basically you and your opponent. And now today, I'll give you one example in New Hampshire. So Kelly Ayotte today, she's on the air. Her opponent, Maggie Hassan, is on the air. And in this week alone, there are no fewer than 7 or maybe 8 outside groups, each with their own schedules up on the air. And we divide them into good guys and bad guys. But you have to figure out, well, the Bloomberg people are advertising on gun control, and the majority forward people are advertising on student loans. So it used to be basically a gunfight, you know, two armies on either side of a field shooting at each other. And today it's much more like a circular gunfight at the OK Corral, and you don't really always know, well, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who do they shoot? Because there are so many more groups, and frequently better funded than the campaigns.
They often have a louder microphone, and you don't control them. It's illegal to. So sometimes their good isn't that helpful. I always say it's akin to, you're in a big sword fight in, you know, a basketball arena, and somebody lets 20 wild boars into the place. And you're trying to tell your wild boars that think they're helping or hurting you from the other guy. And some of the boars are stupid and just, you know, don't always do the right thing. It just becomes a madcap deal, which is why, frankly, the independent expenditure movement's great for people in the media consulting business. We do a lot of it at my firm. But when I'm running an actual campaign, not that I do that in statewide anymore, it would drive me crazy, because as a control freak, I don't really like somebody coming in of $2 million who may be a smart consulting team or may not be, and just, you know, scamming their client or whatever. And it just makes it so much more complicated. And also, you're held accountable for their actions if they're, quote, trying to help you. So it makes it, frankly, less strategically elegant. And at least for me, it's become less fun.
Yeah, it's more unpredictable, more difficult. And, you know, you see your friends who you can't talk to them doing what they think is a masterstroke for you. And you look at the spot and say, oh, God, I wish they hadn't done that.
Right, exactly. That just makes it a lot harder to run a statewide campaign. And as you said, often they have a lot more cash. They have the bigger microphone, yet your campaign is being held accountable for whatever they might do on a whim. And sometimes it's some rich donor, and they've got sycophantic consultants that is all about making the donor happy. So when the fourth wife psychic nutritionist says, hey, we need a spot about this, it goes up on the air for 1,000 points, whether or not it's smart. So after Dole, in the general election, you did not go to the Bush campaign. You went to one of the pioneering early independent expenditures, and you're quite famous for that. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about those days? They're going to recognize a name you're going to bring up in a minute.
After the Dole for President campaign came to a inglorious end in '88, much later that summer, I went to work for a relatively small, brand new group called the National Security Political Action Committee, which was a group of basically retired admirals who wanted to raise money and do some spots for Bush because they thought that he was dramatically better on defense. So I said, sure. And we did our first ad, I think in June, and we basically did a Bush positive, basically did our own version of the Bush bio. And that went well, and it raised a little bit more money. So later in the summer, they came to me and they said, well, we got some money, and we'd like to do a spot on the Pledge of Allegiance as an idea for a spot. And I said, I don't think that's going to move many voters, because at this point in the summer, Bush was well behind Dukakis. So I said, what about going to a crime spot? And I was watching closely what the Bush campaign was doing, and they were, Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater and others in the campaign were talking about this new crime case, Willie Horton, who was a criminal in Massachusetts who had been sentenced to, I believe, life for robbing and murdering a 17-year-old boy and also dismembering the boy in a gas station robbery. And Massachusetts at the time had a program which, after X number of years and X number of points for good behavior, you could get an occasional weekend out to sort of test your wings before you were released. And people know the story by now, but long story short, on his 10th weekend pass in 1987, I believe it was, Mr. Horton fled Massachusetts, went to Maryland, where he kidnapped and terrorized a couple and raped the girlfriend. And he was later arrested by Maryland State Police. And Massachusetts said, can we have him back? And Maryland said, well, no, you let him out, so we're not going to let you have him again. So that was the Horton story was all over the place in the spring and summer of 1988. I think Bush himself was talking about it. So, we couldn't talk to the Bush campaign, but I thought they probably wouldn't do a crime commercial with Horton since he was African American. So we were this little independent expenditure. We had $300,000. So I thought, well, maybe if we did the spot, the press would pick it up and cover it more, because there was no way that whenever the story was retold in the press, there's no real good side for Dukakis in that. He looks bad whichever way you discuss it. So we put the spot up in early September. We had $300,000.
Where did it run? Where did it break with the 300? What markets?
We did national cable only.
Okay, got it.
And
so you were
national
making
cable,
the media play. It was going to change the discussion in the campaign.
And it was totally designed to get reporters to write about the story, because there's no way that $300,000 or even $3 million would have had a significant impact on the electorate. The whole play was to get reporters to write about the spot and to write about the case, which they did by a factor of 1,000 more than we ever expected them to. And they kept writing about it and writing about it and writing about it. By the time the spot aired, Bush had either pulled ahead or was ahead of Dukakis. So the Horton spot was not decisive in any way, but it certainly got the momentum going even more towards Bush 41. And then, of course, later that September, the Bush campaign produced their own version of a crime spot with the now famous revolving door spot, but they did not mention Horton at all.
Right, but Horton created the issue because it was so press-worthy. Let's take a listen to the spot right here. We'll do the audio track.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So boom, the media explodes, they go crazy. The crime issue becomes a negative for Dukakis, but the process attacks began, which is, how dare you use, scary picture of an African-American in a spot, even though said African-American was a huge felon. What do you remember from that time? Did you ever think, the criticism of the spot may overwhelm the message, or you were happy just to see crime take over the campaign for a while and then the campaign run with it with the revolving door?
The goal was to get press attention to the story, and it got that by, as I said, by a factor of 1,000. It was just written about endlessly, and no matter how you wrote the story, I think when voters read those stories and saw the TV stories, they came to the same conclusion, which was, why did Mike Dukakis veto a bill which would have shut this program down? There's no way to tell the Horton story without looking bad for Governor Dukakis. And the Dukakis campaign basically ignored the spot. And of course, later, when Bernie Shaw asked his question of Governor Dukakis during the debate, he gave the famous line that he wouldn't be angry with the rapist, even though he'd raped his wife, and he looked even worse then. But what's never been challenged in the Horton story is it's the exact same set of facts which won the local newspaper the Pulitzer Prize. The Lawrence Eagle Tribune won the Pulitzer for all their stories on the Horton case. The pictures were the two mugshots that existed. I think the controversy started about whether or not you could include an African-American criminal in a political spot.
People forget that was the official mugshot. That was one thing that was a not unimportant nuance, because there were limited things available, and that was it. I remember the campaign had us out shooting victim interviews too. I mean, once the crime issue broke open, the campaign just ground on it, and Dukakis really never got out of the defensive crouch on that. Now, Roger still gets steam coming out of his ears when people bring up the Willie Horton thing, even though, one, he knows it was effective. Two, I think he knows it was a fair issue. And three, he knows we put the Bush campaign behind those issues right afterward without, albeit mentioning Willie Horton. What, will you think he's worried it would screw up his humanitarian award or something, which I don't think he'd ever be up for? Why do you think? Because I remember that became kind of a bugaboo thing for Roger for a while.
Roger was blamed by some people as having created the ad, and the campaign accurately said this was a small independent expenditure group that created the ad. We had nothing to do with it, and Roger did not know it was coming, and had nothing to do with it in any way, shape, or form. 2 years later, when Roger's doing the Ohio governor's race, I think for Governor Voinovich, the Democratic chairman in Ohio filed an FEC complaint, just basically for harassment. So that wound through FEC for a couple of years, and basically the commission, as it always does, splits 3-3 and says nothing there. So we were all exonerated of the FEC complaint. But Roger was very sensitive about being accused of having done the spot because he didn't do it, and he was offended that he was even linked to the spot.
Yeah, I think the media jumps to the assumption, too, that Roger was in a trench coat in a creepy parking garage kicking a briefcase full of cash and pictures of Willie Horton over to you. You know, they always think it's a conspiracy like that, when instead it's a media tactic to raise an issue that, as you said, did no favors to Dukakis. But hard to resist a conspiracy when you assume one. Well, one of the sidebars here is you are a dead ringer for Steven Spielberg, the famous director. So it's always been an idea to get you out here for dinner and have some Hollywood people wander by and get the double take that I'm sure you get all the time and say, oh, we met working together back after the Dole campaign when he was working on Willie Horton spots, and wait to see how long the fire of horror would spread through Hollywood. Do people come up and ask for pictures and selfies? Because it is incredibly funny that you're a dead ringer. You could be a stunt double for Spielberg. Every day of my life, I get either the Spielberg look, as I know what it is, or people ask me, are you Steven Spielberg? Once I was in the Sacramento airport, and I had gotten there like 5 hours early because my meeting ended early. And I'm standing there in the food court trying to figure out which taco I wanted. And a very elderly, very sweet man walked up to me. I think he was Hispanic. And he said, Mr. Spielberg, I loved what you said about your mother at the Academy Awards, because it was just how I think about my mother. And he went on for like a couple minutes. I didn't want to shatter the illusion that he just met Steven Spielberg. So I kind of smiled, and he asked me what my next movie was. And luckily I knew that my next movie then was AI. And I said, thank you, Mr. Spielberg. And then he went off. And I thought, thank God. I didn't want to pop his balloon. But then I get my taco, and I'm sitting down, and 30 seconds later he comes back out. Mr. Spielberg, would you sign an autograph for my daughter Shirley? And I said, sure. So I signed to Shirley from Steven Spielberg. And by then I'm thinking, I got to get out of here. So I'm picking up my taco to go someplace else where I'm less recognizable. And he brings his supervisor out. And I autograph a thing for her daughter. So it's, there are worse people to look like. I guess I could look like Saddam Hussein or somebody, but Spielberg is a good one to look like, and I've indirectly benefited over the years from being mistaken for Spielberg. I think we're going to have to go over to Paramount, where I have lunch in the commissary or the executive dining room, and walk around, and you can loudly say, I'm shutting this picture down. I hate the script, and just cause a panic on here in Hollywood.
We are in September. We're after Labor Day. The campaign has begun in earnest, not only in the presidential level, but in the states. What is a day in the life like for a media consultant now? What is 24 hours in the life of somebody like you who's doing a couple of candidate Senate campaigns, some independent expenditure works? You're right in the thick of the cycle now. What's 24 hours like in a typical day right now?
The biggest factor in life these days is email. There is not a single event in any state, in any campaign, that does not generate an email and then an email chain that comments on the email. So, in a given day now in September of election year, you're going to get 400 or 500 emails, mostly of clips, many of them redundant, many of them not really relevant, but you still have to sort of scan through them and try to figure out how is this relevant to me. We pretty much get polling data every week now from every one of our campaigns. We're doing Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, Mark Kirk in Illinois, John McCain in Arizona, and we're doing the Portman Super PAC. So you have all these floods of information, and the biggest part of your day is trying to figure out what's relevant and how do I think through what next week's spot is based on these new flows of information from polls and clips and developments.
Yeah, that is always the most important thing in a campaign to me. How do you think through what's coming next to try to stay a jump ahead and keep strategic control of the race? And all this tactical noise is a real threat to the ability to do that. You get useful information, but you can be in that bell jar of millions of things swirling around. We're out in normal voter world. They're just overwhelmed that it's your job to punch a clear narrative through. And the noise makes that harder, not easier. I think that's the biggest weak spot in a lot of campaigns today.
Luckily, none of my campaigns do this, but I've seen other efforts where they spend as much time on figuring out what they're going to say on Twitter all afternoon as they do as to what their next TV spot's going to be.
I agree. I'm a digital obsessive, but people forget that the big broad brush is something digital can carry too, rather than chopping the electorate up into molecules and doing kind of dumb molecule messaging. And again, letting tactics overwhelm strategy. That's the big threat these days because the tactical toolbox is so fun to play with. So let's talk Trump. What would you tell him if we were to duct tape Donald Trump to a chair and make him listen to you for half an hour? What would your advice be?
Well, of course, I did a lot of the anti-Trump spots in the middle stages of the primary, so I'm not a Trump fan, although I do hope that Trump does well in the fall simply to preserve the Senate. With 4 senators on the line, it's important that Trump do well for the sake of the Republican Senate. I do not think Trump has much of a shot to win. I'd say probably has maybe a 10% shot to win. I don't see how the numbers work out for him. I don't see how you can run 8 or 9 points behind where Romney ran among women and 5 to 10 points among Hispanics. I don't see how that math works, that you ever recoup enough angry white male voters to make up for those deficits when you think of that Governor Romney was a terrific candidate and lost by 4. And it's a tougher demographic target this year than it was in 2012. So I do not think that Mr. Trump is going to succeed, but I hope he runs well.
I'm exactly where you are. I think he's in a mathematical chokehold he's not going to get out of, and I will be happy to see him lose because I think he's horrible on so many levels. But the Senate is the game here, and it'll be interesting to see if we have a total Trump collapse or he can keep it close. We worked together at Right to Rise. We were both supporting Jeb Bush, and we were together in the IE. When did you start to feel that Trump wasn't just going to be a 25% problem? Because, we talked about this a lot during the campaign, but might actually be the nominee, kind of supplant Cruz among the resentment vote and be able to run the table up to that 42, 44%.
There was one very clear moment for me when I thought, oh my God, Donald Trump could be the nominee. The moment was this, when he attacked John McCain's record as a POW, and I thought, oh my God, Trump has gone too far this time. McCain is a genuine hero who performed heroic service under the worst of conditions, and Trump has gone out and just flat out ignorantly attacked him. I thought, this will push it over the edge. This is the end for Trump. And then nothing.
Yeah.
Among Trump supporters, it just didn't seem to matter, even though I think they all kind of knew that McCain is the real deal hero, and he didn't deserve being attacked so unfairly and so sleazily by Trump. And I thought, if the attack on McCain is not going to work, then the level of anger which Trump is channeling has a really good shot for the nomination. And when you got a field of 15 or 150 or 1,500, however many it was, that could get him over the top. And I think that's what ultimately happened. When you've got a gigantic field and one guy who is an entertainer, who is a populist at the best of terms, who will say and do anything, he can get to 35 all the time. But I think 35 is going to be a pretty familiar number come the fall in some places.
He's still running in the primary, but I agree. I started to see bullets bounce off him among his third to 40% of the vote. They just wanted to blow it up, and they were going to hang on to him. What a lot of people don't know about Right to Rise is we made a lot of anti-Trump ads early that we tested, and we tested on surveys, and we found two disconcerting findings. One, none of those ads did anything to help Jeb, and we thought better to get the other 65 and surround Trump by beating the people in our competitive lane. And two, they didn't do that much to hurt Trump. People in the Trump world, the Trump 40%, 30%, that hunk, had an incredible appetite to consume bad information about Trump and stick with him. And I think other campaigns found that out as, the wheel turned throughout. It was just very hard to get those base Trump voters off Trump.
Yeah, it's unbelievably sad for us who know and love Jeb Bush, who think this was the guy who would be by far and away the best president if his last name wasn't Bush.
Yeah, no, exactly. It was also not a year for the sober thinker. It was the year of the grievance scream, and now we're looking at the whole franchise teetering over a cliff. Now, what do you think Roger Ailes, your former employer and a one-time boss of mine, what do you think Roger would say to him in a debate prep session? There have been these rumors in the press that Roger's helping a little. You know Roger's personality. I know it. He is a drill sergeant debate instructor with a lot of charm mixed in. How do you think he would try to prep Trump for debate? What would he tell him?
I think Roger would focus on a couple of different aspects. I think his first goal in debate prep is to give Trump one-liners. I think Roger was one of the, if not the father, one of the fathers of, I'm not going to use my opponent's age and experience line for Reagan in 84 in that debate. So my guess is Roger is focusing on giving Trump good, pithy, funny, edgy one-liners on Secretary Clinton, 2, advising on sort of general atmospherics and lead into the debate. And, do we have people outside chanting Trump, 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 or do we have people with email signs trying to hector Hillary as they pull up to Hofstra or to whoever else the venues are? I guess he's also working on, well, what if they ask you a gotcha question, who's the president of Uzbekistan? And how do you answer things like that? Because my guess is that in the 3 presidential debates, somebody will try to just show that Trump doesn't have the base of knowledge that Secretary Clinton does.
Yeah, I'd hit him with the 8th grade geometry test, No, I agree. I think Roger's great at one-liners. There's a great Trump one-liner about email. Then some mix up in the debate where she's saying, well, that's my record. That's the truth. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Well, why don't you email it to me? I think would be a moment. Do you see any bright signs in the Senate races you're doing where there might be a Republican senatorial candidate win where right now people are pretty glum? I know Mark Kirk is fighting for his life, but he has a pretty tough race there just generically in Illinois, and Trump at the top of the ticket makes it even more challenging. I'm doing an IE to help Pat Toomey, and he's in the hunt, but it's another tough state. Do you have any little sunlight you see somewhere, a prediction you might want to make?
Yes. We're doing better on the Republican side than you would have forecast simply looking at the amount of money that's been spent, pro and con, and the layout of these different campaigns. 6 months ago, Rob Portman was basically where Pat Toomey and a couple others are today, thought to be barely even, may lose. And today, Rob Portman is up 10, 12 points in both public and private surveys. And the Democrats are pulling out lots of their money that they had booked to help Ted Strickland. You know, Rob Portman's such a better candidate than Ted Strickland, and he's run an almost flawless race and had heavy outside support, and has done really well. Kelly Ayotte is in a dead-even race in New Hampshire, even though she's been heavily outspent by multiple millions of dollars in the past month. Mark Kirk, who has always been the number one, he's going to lose, he's got the most vulnerable seat. Mark Kirk is still alive within a handful of points, and he has won every race that he has run. He was never supposed to win. 5 House races in a very tough suburban Chicago district, and the 2010 race in a blue state. And Kirk won them all. He is, to me, a very heroic story because, you know, most people who would have had the stroke that he had would not have gotten off the floor, let alone get up, recover, rebuild your life, rebuild your ability to walk, rebuild your ability to speak and think clearly. And, you know, he may win, he may lose, but he is a very inspiring story. What else can I say about John McCain? John McCain, if you've never read Faith of Our Fathers about John McCain, which he wrote with Mark Salter, it is an unbelievably great book about a man who survived against all odds on unbelievable conditions. And, you know, McCain is ahead now, and I think he will continue to stay ahead unless Trump somehow implodes in Arizona. Hillary's put up 1,000 points of TV in Arizona, which is a red state most of the time. So she's trying to make life difficult for Trump, and that may spill over some to McCain. But I think at the end of the day, John McCain's going to beat Ann Kirkpatrick.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll put money on McCain now. I'm pulling for Johnny Mack, an old pal of mine. In the other Senate races, you're right. We're either going to see, in my opinion, a surge in ticket splitting as people want to hedge on Hillary, or if Trump is seen purely as a Republican creature, which I'm not sure he is, he's seen more, I believe, as an outlier by those voters, then they could have a very good last 10 days and roll up the carpet. So it's not going to be dull, and for you and the rest of the folks working at the Senate level, I'm pulling for you, and I'm hoping we can do something good in Pennsylvania, where that is a very close race with Toomey. Last question for you. You've been at this for decades, as I am ashamed to admit, so have I. What advice would you give a young operative who would come to you about a career in this business? I get a lot of emails off the podcast about that kind of thing.
I would tell them to look at the history of how politicians communicate in the TV and post-TV era. I think there's some of my younger colleagues coming up today who think it's all digital, it's all Twitter, it's all Facebook advertising. But at the end of the day, all of us in this business on the communication side, we're storytellers. And the stories that Ike advertisers did in the 50s, and the JFK and Nixon advertisers did in the 60s, and Bailey Deardorff did for Jerry Ford in the 70s, the essence of the story doesn't change, because at the end of the day, you're talking about an individual, you're talking about a time in our country's life, and you're talking about how you swing the 20% of the people who are amenable to swinging on Election Day. So the nature of the business in that sense hasn't really changed because it's storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's funny. I tell them essentially the same thing. It's always the same opening too. Hey, old man, you don't get digital. And then I explain I built my first computer with a soldering iron. I've been a computer geek since before you were born. And after we get over that, I do the same thing. It is the story and the way the candidate carries information, the way the campaign amplifies them, which is eternal. Understand that. And then the toolbox is the method by which you can get it across. So it's funny. You kind of learn the same thing through pattern recognition in this business if you hang around long enough and have the luck to learn from losing a few and then win enough that people listen to you. Larry, I want to thank you. Are you on the social media for the kids? Speaking of digital, where can people follow you?
They can't follow me. I lurk in social media, but I don't pop up in social media.
You've always been a mysterious figure, moving around with a low profile, but a huge footprint in Republican politics. I really appreciate your helping me out today and coming on Radio Free GOP.
I love Radio Free GOP. I'm going to buy some T-shirts today.
No, on message. Thank you, my friend.
It's number one for rumors and fun. It's Resistance Podcast. GOP.
Okay, that's our podcast for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Spread the word. Don't forget those great reviews you're giving us on iTunes. That really helps spread the podcast out to new listeners. We're growing every week. It's really been a success, and I thank you for that. There's the noise. The Republican Orthodoxy police are closing in. They are like the federales on Butch. Who are those guys? But they never catch us. We're a little too quick, and we're skedaddling now for a new undisclosed location. I think they're after Larry, too. We're going to have new interviews, a lot of stuff coming in as the campaign heats up. But for now, time to get a move on. So thank you. And remember, in the end, the Republican resistance will prevail, and victory will be ours.
Radio Free GOP, the resistance sound all campaign long.
This has been Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance, with your host, Mike Murphy.